Okay, Year 11. This is part 1 of a video series that I'm making for you guys. It's focusing on a particular area of the civil rights course, and that's 1963 to 1965. Protests and legislation. I say part 1 because I'm going to go through loads and loads of stuff in this video, and there'll be loads more that I haven't yet touched on, so there'll be at least one more video coming on this topic, maybe even 2 more, because it's a huge topic. Loads of stuff happens in 1963 and 64 and 65 that you need to know about for the civil rights course. It's a really important era, loads to talk about, so that's why I'm making at least 2 if not 3 videos talking about the protests and the subsequent legislation between 1963 and 1965. Now, first things first, I've used a word there that some of you may have forgotten, okay, and it's an important word because it's in the video title, and that is legislation. Remember, I'm sure most of you do remember what this means, but those of you who don't, remember that legislation is basically a law when something becomes a law. Okay, so when we talk about civil rights legislation, it's basically laws to give, well, in this case, African Americans, but it can be other people, their civil rights. Civil rights legislation, are laws that give people their civil rights. So when I mention civil rights legislation, that's what I'm talking about. It's the laws that are passed by the government, the American government, to give people their civil rights. Okay, so 1963, I'm going to start doing it in chronological order. 1963 is a huge year for civil rights protests. Okay, really significant year. Because there are 2 main things that happened in 1963 that I'm going to talk about. The first one of those is the Birmingham Peace Marches. Okay, the Birmingham Peace Marches, really important event that happens in the civil rights movement. Remember that the Birmingham Peace Marches are part of something called Project C. Okay, with the C standing for confrontation. We're going to confront Birmingham in Alabama, which at that time was considered arguably the most segregated part of America. Nothing in the city of Birmingham, had been desegregated or integrated. So everything was separate for black people and white people. Okay, now it was led by loads of different civil rights groups, the Birmingham Peace Marches, the SNCC, the SCLC, the Alabama Christian Movement for Human Rights. If you've forgotten who they are or what they are, remember that there's a glossary at the back of your textbook, so go and have a look at that, because I'm not going to go into that because it'll take forever to talk about them. But different civil rights groups get involved in Project C and the Birmingham Peace Marches, and as I say, Birmingham, they pick Birmingham because it's arguably the most segregated part of America, or certainly city in America. Nothing has been desegregated, nothing has been integrated, so they decide that they want to do something about this because it's not on in their eyes. So what happened in Birmingham? Well, actually, before I talk about what happened in Birmingham, let's give you a bit of background. So obviously the Birmingham Peace Marches is not just a big march, it's a planned campaign of sit-ins and boycotts and marches to try and draw attention to what's going on in Birmingham. But what is going on in Birmingham? Well, 45% of Birmingham's inhabitants, the people who lived in Birmingham, were African American. So nearly half the city was black and the other half was white. Okay, so naturally it's quite shocking that the city is so segregated, that everything's segregated, that 45% of the people have, as we know, usually much poorer facilities. Black schools were often worse than white schools. Black public facilities were worse than white facilities. So this is going on. It's not a particularly nice situation for half the inhabitants of the city. There's also a very active Ku Klux Klan in Birmingham. So they basically, as I said before, they pick Birmingham because it's such a racist place. Okay, and they know that whatever they do in Birmingham is going to bring about publicity. Remember, that's what they're after. They want publicity. They want to draw attention to the evils and the racism of the whites, to get sympathy, particularly from the American government, from the American people, but worldwide as well. Remember as well, I talked about this in lessons, that there have been many attacks on African American homes and businesses in Birmingham with the use of bombs, to the point where Birmingham had actually earned the rather macabre nickname of Bombingham, because so many attacks on African Americans, particularly using bombs, happened. So again, that's another reason why they picked Birmingham. And they also picked Birmingham because, as we know, infamously, the chief of police in Birmingham is a man called EUGENE Bull Connor. Okay, we know all about Bull Connor, or you should do, because we've talked about him a lot in lessons. Okay, so the first, so I got loads of bits of paper, it's all over the place today. The first Peace March happens on the 3rd of April 1963 in Birmingham. Okay, and very simply, the protesters, the people who take part in that march, are arrested. They're arrested by Bull Connor and the police department. Now, after a few weeks of continuous marches, but remember there's other things going on, boycotts and sit-ins, etc., most of the protesters were in prison, including Martin Luther King. Jail, I should say, not prison. Now, once most of the protesters had been locked up in the jails, the SNCC then began recruiting younger people to take part in the marches, culminating in the first, what became known as the Children's March, on the 2nd of May 1963. Now, most of the people who took part in the Children's March were teenagers, so they were under 18, but some of them were very, very young children, as young as 6, taking part in these marches. And by the end of the 2nd of May, when that first Children's March took place, again, most of those teenagers and children had been arrested and put in the jail. The next day, on the 3rd of May 1963, the children march again, the ones who haven't been locked up, but by now the jails were full. Okay, because remember, thousands of people have taken part in these marches, and the jails are only so big, so they're full. So the police changed their tactics, and Bull Connor ordered dogs to be set on the protesters. We've seen images of these both in the textbook and on video clips, and indeed we saw a bit from the film The Butler, where again these dogs are attacking the teenagers and the children who are marching. Connor, so as well as that, Connor also ordered the fire department to spray the protesters with very powerful fire hoses. Okay, now I've just mentioned the footage. We've seen it, it's on YouTube. You can go and have a look at it again if you want to refresh your memory. But the footage of this was shown around the world, and it horrified people around the world, but particularly around America. It horrified people, including, very importantly, the President John F. Kennedy, who I'll come back to in a minute. We'll talk about him now. So Kennedy, how he tries to sort out the problems in Birmingham, tries to bring the peace again, he sent a negotiator to help work out the differences. So you had the protesters on one side and the mayor of Birmingham on the other side, and Kennedy sent this negotiator to help discuss the issues and try and come to a solution. This actually leads to a backlash from the white racists in Birmingham, who then start attacking African American businesses again and homes, which then actually leads to black riots on the 11th and 12th of May. So it actually causes even more turmoil and tension and violence. Kennedy eventually has to call in federal troops to deal with this, to put the problems down, to stop the rioting and the protesting and the violence. Okay, so after this, after all this has happened, actually most white businesses in the city see sense, for want of a better phrase, and they prefer to actually make some concessions rather than continue to lose money, because they're not really getting any trade while all this is going on. So a lot of the white businesses do desegregate, and in fact most shops and most lunch counters become desegregated. So again, you don't have a section for white people and a section for African Americans, it's universal. Black people are allowed to apply for jobs as well, that they hadn't been able to apply for before, that had only been available for white people. However, it's not a complete fix. There are still a lot of areas that are still segregated. Violence and racism still remains against African Americans in Birmingham, so it's not a completely solved situation, but it's better than it was before. But why was Birmingham, there you go, so significant? Why is it so significant? Why have I spent so long talking about this? Well, Kennedy, when he's seen all this going on, when he's seen the protests and the violence and the riots and what have you, he wants to avoid this happening again. He wanted to avoid a similar situation in the future. Remember, all this footage of the dogs and the fire hoses has been going around on the TV, both in America and around the world. So Kennedy wants to sort this out and make sure it doesn't happen again. So he pressed on with a civil rights bill. Okay, now just to remind you, remember that when something is, before something can become a law, it starts off as a bill, which is essentially just a bit of paper with the proposed law written down on it. Okay, so we propose that this becomes law. Okay, that's what a bill is. And then a bill is voted on by Congress in this situation, and then passed. Okay, and then it becomes a law, an act. So Kennedy wants to push forward with getting a civil rights bill on the table that can be voted on, and hopefully, again, eventually get African Americans in particular more rights and stop this kind of thing happening again. The second event that I'm going to talk about that happens in 1963 is the March on Washington, or Washington DC, to give it its full name. Obviously, Washington DC, the capital city of America. Now, this was organised partly to show support for the Civil Rights Bill. Obviously, Kennedy's said that he's going to press on with this Civil Rights Bill, and the March on Washington is partly designed as a way of showing support for that. Brilliant, we're getting a Civil Rights Bill put forward. Hopefully, within a year or two, that'll become a law, and it'll improve the lives of African Americans, particularly in the South, but nationwide as well. And the March on Washington takes place on the 28th of August, 1963. 28th of August 1963, and it is a march attended by over 250,000 people. Okay, a massive amount of people attend this march. Over 250,000 people, 250,000. They march for jobs and for freedom. Okay, so it's not just about rights for African Americans, but obviously, as we know, African Americans are struggling with, well, this in particular, freedom. If things are segregated, they're not free to use the same things that white people are. And jobs, as we know, they're struggling as well to apply for and get the same jobs that white people are getting. So that's what the purpose behind the march, if you will. Okay, that's what they marched for. It's famous, the March on Washington, for Martin Luther King's Dream Speech. Okay, just to refresh your memory, I'm going to read you a little bit of the Dream Speech from Martin Luther King. And then I'll talk a bit more about that afterwards. So, Martin Luther King in his dream speech, he says, "I still have a dream. It is a dream deeply rooted in the American dream. I have a dream that one day this nation will rise up and live out the true meaning of its creed. We hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal." So what he's saying there is, it's actually in the Declaration of Independence for America that they say that all men, or people, are created equal. So really, colour, in this case, shouldn't come into it. "I have a dream that one day on the red hills of Georgia, sons of former slaves and the sons of former slave owners will be able to sit down together at the table of brotherhood. I have a dream that one day, even the state of Mississippi, a state sweltering with the heat of injustice, sweltering with the heat of oppression, will be transformed into an oasis of freedom and justice. I have a dream that my 4 little children will one day live in a nation where they'll be not judged by the colour of their skin, but by the content of their character." Okay, so I haven't delivered it in nearly the same amount of gusto as Martin Luther King did, but you can see, just listening to the words, a really heartfelt, eloquent, well-worded speech, and it was all done from, wasn't done from notes, it was all done from his head. He did it off the cuff. He did have a written speech down, but after speaking for about 5 or 10 minutes, he put that to one side and then spoke from the heart. So a really amazing speech. So why was the March on Washington important? Well, there are quite a few reasons why it's important. First of all, I've talked about this already, but over 250,000 people took part, and that showed that the civil rights movement had a huge amount of support. If 250,000 people show up to march for something, in support of something, it shows that it's pretty well supported. That's a huge amount of people. So it shows the nation and the world that the civil rights movement has a lot of support behind it, and it's a popular movement. Kind of tied in with this, it naturally gets a lot of publicity. You know, again, it's the footage from it is recorded and shown all around the world. Many celebrities from the time attended. The singer-songwriter Bob Dylan, who was very popular in the 1960s. Two very famous actors took part in the speech as well. In the protest as well, the march even. Paul Newman and Marlon Brando. You might not have heard of Paul Newman, but you may have heard of Marlon Brando from The Godfather. The march increased the pressure on politicians. So naturally, again, with all the people attending the march, it kind of increases the pressure on Kennedy and the government to do something about it. It's almost like the march was a way of saying, hurry up with the civil rights bill. Okay, you've got it and you're talking about it and it keeps stalling, so hurry up with it. Get some laws down that can, help African Americans and other people get civil rights, freedom, jobs, freedom from oppression, etc. And finally, obviously, as the Dream speech showed, and the organisation of the march, it showcased kind of Martin Luther King's abilities and his organisation. He is now the undisputed leader, if you will, of the civil rights movement. So it gets a lot more attention for him as well. So after the march ended, actually, a lot of the civil rights leaders who'd taken part in the march went to the White House to meet with President John F. Kennedy and Vice President Johnson, who both at that point said, right, we fully support the civil rights bill, we're going to get this passed. Okay, now obviously it wasn't going to be as simple as that, as we know there were many racist senators in the Senate and racist congressmen in the Congress, or even if they weren't, they knew that a lot of their voters were, so they had to be very careful about showing support for a bill like this. So it wasn't going to be easy. It looked like it was going to be an even bigger job, a harder job, once JFK, John F. Kennedy, was assassinated in November of that year in 1963. So it wasn't going to be an easy task. And